For explicating the prompt for literary analysis, there are several things that you need to consider. Now, some of the things that I'm going to talk about are skills that you can use for any prompt that you're given to write. However, what most of this is going to be about is specific to literary analysis. The first thing that you need to consider is what are the implicit questions. Then, the explicit questions. We talked briefly about that earlier in the year, but I just wanted to remind you. Since we're focusing on literary analysis, we also want to think about the contexts. What reading context is the prompt specifically guiding us toward? Remember, just a reminder that the various contexts include reader response, historical, socio-cultural, gender, psychological, all of those different types of contexts that we talked about. After that I've answered those and considered those, the next step for me is to identify different motifs based on those. Remember, a motif is a topic that the author is writing about. So it's going to be 1 to 3 words and it will not have a verb. After I've done that, I need to develop a theme statement that's based on the motif. If you remember from earlier, when we talked about theme statements, we want to make sure that they are universal, that they are observational, and that they have a qualifier. Okay? And then ultimately, after I've done that, I would develop a thesis statement based on all of that above. We're going to go through each of these with a sample question based on the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, and then you'll be applying what we learn in class with your own example based on The Crucible. At the very beginning of school, we looked at this particular prompt, and we wrote our own baseline response about To Kill a Mockingbird since we all read that over the summer. So what I'm going to do is use this to demonstrate the different skills, and then I want you to apply the same thing, using the same prompt to the play The Crucible. Okay? So the first thing that I need to look at are what are the implicit questions. Social or political attitudes. Okay? I need to name that. What are the attitudes and traditions? Okay? Then I need to name the techniques that the author uses to analyze that or to influence the readers. Okay? The explicit question is going to be analyzing it, how the author uses those techniques to change that particular attitude. Okay? The next step is to consider the different contexts. So if I'm looking at this particular prompt and I'm thinking about the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, the attitudes or traditions that I think that she wishes to modify would be racism, sexism, classism, and hypocrisy. If you look at the first 3, racism, sexism, and classism, I can consider all of those to be forms of prejudice. So that kind of gives it one big overreaching motif. The next step would be for me to look at the techniques. That's the next implicit question. So just off the top of my head, when I'm thinking about To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm thinking about literary foil, symbol, metaphor, imagery, narrative voice, flashback, to name a few. Contexts, again, I have a wealth from which I can choose. The historical context, I can use both the macrocosm of the civil rights movement, because that's when Harper Lee was writing, and the microcosm of the Jim Crow South, because that's when the novel is set. The biographical context, lends itself because Harper Lee, when she was growing up, remembers the Scottsboro trials. And then, of course, there's the gender context when we examine feminism versus, sexism. Now, looking back at the prompt and looking at all of my brainstorming, I need to ask myself, which of these are the most on prompt and which do I have the most evidence for? That's going to make it the easiest for me to write. Okay? So just looking at that and thinking about that, the motif that I'm going to go with is prejudice. Okay? And the context, historical and biographical. So that motif is prejudice. Now, the next step is for me to look at it and develop a theme statement, which, again, let's remember, is an observation about the human condition, is a universal, meaning it can be applied to other pieces of literature and to life in general, and it has a qualifier, meaning that it's not an absolute. Sometimes it's not true. The theme that I'm coming up with prejudice, one example of man's inhumanity to man, often reflects the ignorance of the society in which it lives. You'll notice that it's an observation. We're talking about something that happens in the world. It's universal. It's one example of mankind's inhumanity to man. And there's a qualifier in there, like the word often. So it's not always reflecting the ignorance, it's just most of the time. So that makes it not an absolute.